What's going on, everyone? Welcome to a brand new Flutter tutorial series where I go over some tips, tricks, and hints and a bit of advice as to how you can create your own app in Flutter. And more specifically, how do you go about creating an app in general? Like, what are the ideas that you have to go over? And this can be applied to not just app development, this could be applied to even just ordinary software development or just designing essentially anything. So, as an example, uh, I thought I'd like to give you this. So let's say that I want to design an app. And in this case, I want to design and create a machine learning app using Flutter because it's what I've been learning and I think Flutter is really cool. So what do I do? How do I start? So the first thing I would think about is what's the purpose of my app? So for any app that you want to design or create, you got to think about why you want to create. Right. It could be for something specific, like maybe for a client, or it could be something in general, like maybe you just want to try out Flutter. And in this case, you want to try creating a machine learning app using Flutter, right? Figuring out what reason you want to create your app for makes it a lot easier to work with and really helps you in the next few steps. So once you've figured out exactly what you want to do or why you want to do it, and kind of figure out just the basics of I want to do this because it's maybe something fun I want to try out, or if it's a task that you have to complete. The next thing you want to do is think about, well, what is your app actually going to do? Like here I've specified, yeah, it's a machine learning app, but exactly what does it do? Like machine learning is a broad field and can be applied to almost anything. So let's say in this case, I want the app to, let me think. Let's say I want to recognize drawings, right? Like simple design elements, let's say maybe squares, circles, being able to identify different shapes. I want the app. So in this case, I want the app to use machine learning algorithms to identify shapes and or items drawn onto, let's say, a page or a canvas or something as such. Yeah. So once you've figured out what you're going to be doing, you're going to create a machine learning app. It's important to figure out what exactly it's going to do. What is the big picture? What's it going to actually do? Right. So you may have already figured that in the previous step, but in this case, I did say I want to create a machine learning app, and this is just for fun, but I don't know exactly what it's going to be doing. So in this case, I want the app to use machine learning algorithms to identify shapes and or items drawn onto a page or a canvas. All right. And then from here, you think about what are the functions, tasks, the subtasks that your program is going to do. This is kind of a process of design, and you don't, and these aren't the exact steps that you need to follow. Um, but this just kind of helps for our future workshops and tutorials, just to be able to understand our method of thinking and be able to follow along a lot easier. So usually we think of a technology or something that we want to implement, and then we think about, well, what is it that we're going to implement, or what type of app are we going to produce? And eventually we think about what is it going to do? What's the big picture for this app? And then from here, once you figured out what your app's going to do, so it doesn't have to be machine learning specifically. You could make an app that, let's say, uh, implements, let's say, image processing. Let's say it's a little camera system that detects every time a bird comes onto a fence, it takes a picture straight away. So for that, for the description, the main description would be something like, I want the app to be able to recognize when a bird has landed on the fence and take a photo once it does. Something as simple as that. And then from there, you can break this problem down into smaller categories. It's essentially a top down design and a bottom up implementation, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I might as well write that up here. So this is something that you may see called top-down design. There might be other terms for this, but essentially you're designing this application or solution from top to bottom, essentially from the highest level. So what is the app going to do in general, to the more specific functions and operations that it's going to perform. So breaking it down, what machine learning algorithm am I going to use, for instance? Maybe I'm using different machine learning algorithms, maybe I'm comparing them. So in this case, it's just using one machine learning algorithm. So I might as well reword this. A machine learning algorithm. I don't know what it is at the moment, but I'm just going to call it that for the time being. And so what's it specifically going to do? What are the sub tasks or functions or operations that I want to do? So the user is allowed to draw an image or draw a shape onto the page or canvas, right? I mean, you could do this. You could do this top-down design a few different ways. Think about what's going to happen, like what's the process, and then from there, think about the different functions that are associated with those different steps. So in this case, user draws a shape onto the page or canvas. That's usually the first thing that I want to happen. And once that's done, the user presses a button that could be a play button or something as such, to allow the app. Let me reword this. So essentially, what happens when you press a button? I'm thinking that the app scans the image and tries to identify what shape that is. So user presses a button. Actually, I'm just going to leave it at that. User presses a button, and then what happens? The application scans the shape or drawing or whatever. And then maybe something like the application. And I always put like the user or the application just so that you know what is actually. So the user, that's the thing, right? That's the thing that's interacting with the system, or that's the object that's essentially doing whatever this task is here. So the user draws a shape onto the page or canvas. The user presses a button. This is all user interaction. It just allows you to kind of break things down into different stages. In this case, the application scans the shape or drawing. The user doesn't have to do anything. Once the user presses the button, it automatically does it. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. And this kind of helps me as well when I'm designing things, just to separate them. And it also helps with debugging as well, to make sure each step is working as required. So now I'm going to write the application. So once it scans the shape or drawing, checks, or let's say uses the data or the machine learning algorithm to detect what shape it is, right? And once I've done this, what do I want it to do? Well, user draws a shape onto the page or a canvas. User presses a button. The application scans the shape drawing. The application uses the data or a machine learning algorithm to detect what shape it is. And sometimes, like this is pretty long. This is a pretty long description. Sometimes you will have no idea what to do. Like if you don't know anything about machine learning, or if you don't know exactly what algorithm to use, you could still keep it general, right? It's just that process, like what happens, like will it, once it's done scanning the shape or drawing, what's going to happen, right? That's essentially what you're trying to say. You don't have to be specific. This is just keeping it essentially at a design stage, not implementation. So you don't have to worry about specific SDK or packages or anything like that yet. When you're designing something, just thinking about how you're going to go about solving this problem. So once we've created, or once it's detected what shape it is, it's got to output what shape it is, right? So the application displays or reveals what shape is, or what the shape is. And if it doesn't, then it just comes up with an error message or saying, hey, I can't detect it. And that's essentially it. That's essentially the app, right? That's the main app. Now from here, I essentially do the top-down design once again for each of these, right? So user draws a shape onto the canvas. So I got to figure out, how does the user draw a shape onto the canvas? So the user can draw a shape using a tool, like maybe a circle drawer, like maybe click and drag till the circle gets a large size. Or in this case, what I want the user to do is to be able to draw freely, right? So with their finger or something like that. So I'm going to say user draws, I don't know, something like draws freely onto the canvas. And that's essentially it. There's really not much here. I can't think of anything else specific in this part. Essentially, user draws freely onto the canvas. This is, I would say it's important, because drawing a shape, once again, that's still a bit vague. It's like how they're going to draw the shape. Draws freely is probably a better term for it. But essentially what I'm trying to say is they're able to draw without restriction. They are allowed to draw it on the canvas. They can just put a large scribble onto the canvas. That's totally fine. And then the user presses a button. So, gotta figure out what happens when the user presses a button. The canvas is disabled temporarily, right? So once the user presses a button, I don't want them drawing over the thing again. Just maybe if the app takes a while to process everything, I don't want them drawing while the app is scanning. So what I would do is I would temporarily disable the canvas, and then I would probably, what else? When the user presses a button, maybe I'll call a function or call a class or something like this that starts the scanning procedure. So call a function. So let's say the application calls a function or class or whatever it is that that starts the scanning procedure, right? Just breaking it down into these two steps, right? When the user presses a button, canvas is disabled by the application, right? It's automatic. Like the user doesn't disable the canvas. And then the application calls a function or class that starts the scanning procedure. So you can, because you can break this down into further steps if you know what you're doing. Like what I'm trying to say is, if you already know how the scanning procedure is going to work, for instance, convert the image into a numerical matrix or something as such, right? If you already know that you want to convert it into a matrix of integers, and then you want to process it using linear algebra or something, you can do that. If you have no clue how it's going to scan anything, you can leave it like that for the time being. That's totally fine, right? You're essentially designing based off what you already know, right? That's kind of how you start off. And even if you don't know, you could do a bit of research into how, and research could just be something simple as Googling it. Just figure out the procedure, right? Not nothing specific like the certain package class or widget that you use. Just specifically, how would you take an image or take the canvas, or let's say just take an image, or take something and then convert that into a form that can be used for analysis using the machine learning algorithm. So first thing we'd do, convert the image, commit the image, or if it's a different drawing type or whatever, into a numerical matrix. or something similar. So by the application, like you don't have to put by the application if you already know. It just helps when you refer to this later on that you see that, okay, the app's doing this. The user doesn't do anything. There's no need for the app to wait for user input or anything as such before it does all this. So once we've converted the image, we want to, let me think. What do we want to do? After we convert it to a numerical matrix, we want to send it, we want to do something, right? I am not a machine learning professional, let alone an expert. So let's say I don't know much about machine learning, right? I don't know what's going to happen next. So maybe the application calls a function or class that uses the, I'm going to call it ML for machine learning, algorithm to identify the shape. Right, just calls the function right after it scans it as a numerical matrix. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down here passes in the numerical matrix. Or something like this, okay? I'm still keeping it general, right? Still trying to just keep it as general as possible. I'm not keeping it vague. Remember, I'm not keeping it vague. Like, the application scans the shape or drawing. But when I say keeping it general, I mean leaving options for you. For instance, you can scan it in many different ways, I guarantee you. So if you could probably try one method that might not work. You could try another method. It gives you some more option when you are implementing this. Sometimes if you're not sure exactly what to do, you could put a question mark, or just, if you're unsure, just label it as you're designing it. This is also the initial design. This isn't the final design of your software or app. So once you figured out, I think I'm just going to leave it like this for the time being. You can expand on some of these bottom ones if you want. So once you figured out roughly how your app is going to work, then what you need to think about is a few things. So like, how are you going to implement it? Like, for each of these things, maybe what you could do is you could search up a certain function or class or package in Flutter that allows you to do this. So I know machine learning is a little bit tricky to implement in Flutter, but you can do it. But I'm not sure exactly how to. So what you could do is you could actually search things up, or alternatively, you could take a look at the flutter.dev page if there is anything on there. So the flutter.dev page is the page. It's the page to go to. So definitely, if you've probably installed Flutter using the flutter.dev page, but if you go into docs, you can actually see a whole bunch of documentation on how to get started. A few different widgets are available in the SDK, in the standard SDK, such as a few animation widgets, some interaction models. Like most of this, I haven't used a lot of this stuff. Materials is usually the one that everyone goes to with creating the basic app layout. There's also layout and a few other things as well. And this is definitely a place where you can get started. Maybe think about what your app is going to look like, number one, but also how you can use those widgets in order to perform some of these tasks. Like, the user draws a shape onto the page or canvas. You could probably search that up in here, maybe, I don't know, drawing or something like that. And yeah, you get stuff like these, like painting and effect widgets, or some other things that you might be able to implement into your app. So once you've done the top-down design, you can expand upon it, make it a little more technical to Flutter. And let's say I want to draw a shape onto the page or a canvas. You can search on flutter.dev and just check like what is there, what's available that you can use. You don't have to focus solely on flutter.dev either. If you can't find what you're looking for, there are other pages as well, like pub.dev is a really important one. This is mainly specific to packages. So if you go into pubspec.yaml, you will see that there's a few dependencies in here, Flutter, SDK Flutter. Some additional packages can also be added here. And the way you identify what packages, or well, the way you find these packages is using pub.dev. Pub.dev is really cool, really cool. Like let's say I can't find a way to draw things onto a canvas or a page using the flutter.dev documentation. Let's say there's not much documentation on it here, or I can't find it, or maybe I'm a bit lazy, can't find it. Maybe I don't have much time. And so what I can do is I can go here is maybe type out something like draw or drawing or something like this. And you can sort this by relevance and so on and so forth. There's a few things here. And there's a really cool one here. So this is called hand signature, which allows you to draw your own signature, or essentially draw something onto the canvas. This is pretty cool. And so what you could do is you could check all these pub.dev packages, and if there is a package that isn't in the Flutter SDK that you might want to have a go at using, you can import these into your main.dart file or anything as such. But before you do, you have to make sure that you actually import this. You can actually include this as a dependency. So down here, you would have to include it as a dependency, and usually you would find it in the installing section right here. This allows you to add your package to the pubspec YAML file and therefore be able to access it from any Dart file within your library. Right, and there's a few other ways you could do it. So if you're using FlatLab, I'm pretty sure you just put this in and you should be able to use it. But if you actually want to install it locally, you can install them using the command line and the Flutter command. You can also, and there's also the importing. And then they also give examples as well, so definitely a great way to check out how these packages look, if it's ideally what you want. And yeah, you could implement these into your application. There are also YouTube videos out there that go over the basics of creating apps, or some of them go more technical, more into specific areas, like let's say there might be one on essentially drawing a shape onto the page or canvas. Might be something that you like, might not be something that you like, but definitely something to consider when designing it. So usually, let's say, maybe I'll do something like this, using the package or something, right? Maybe I might also indicate what specific packages I can use in order to essentially get this complete, get this section of the program complete. Be able to draw a shape or page onto the canvas, I'll have to use one of these. And it can be difficult as well to figure out exactly how you can implement this with, let's say, other packages. Like the one thing I definitely find tricky is trying to figure out how you can bring two packages together. Like some packages might have some really specific formatting, but look, like it's essentially the same as if you've done the Flutter tutorials and look at the materials.dart items and just explored it yourself, should be pretty simple. But it's really cool because you do get examples as well, which you can mess around with, have a go at yourself. And you can also see that the example also includes the materials.dart as well as some of the additional packages, right? And you could also go onto GitHub, I'm pretty sure, right, and check out some of these examples. So once you've got the top-down design, once you've figured out, what are the different types of packages that I might be able to use, and once you figured out just the general, well, actually now we've figured out essentially what our program's going to do entirely. And so from here, we go to the bottom-up implementation, bottom. can't spell, bottom up implementation. Essentially what this means is you've taken the big picture, what your app essentially will do, and you've broken it down into smaller categories, smaller tasks, smaller functions, and operations. Now, when you're implementing your program, or when you're actually coding it, you essentially do the opposite, right? You start off with the small tasks such as maybe user draws freely onto canvas, right? That's one function or task that has to be complete, right? So you'd start off by using a specific package in order to allow the user to draw freely onto the canvas, like maybe have a little eraser on the side or a color picker as well. And that's essentially one part of the program complete, and you could put a little tick or something like this to show that you're done. At least that section. All right, and then when you're working your way up, let's say I've completed, I've successfully passed a numerical matrix into another function or class. Maybe I've already figured out the machine learning algorithm, maybe implemented it using a Flutter package, or maybe even another programming language entirely. You can actually, I'm pretty sure, incorporate the things from Java or C++ into Flutter. We won't go over that today, but definitely something to think about. You can actually bring in different files into here. You can bring in other Dart files as well. And then so once you've figured out all of these, once you've figured out how to get all of these working, you can bring them all together and maybe in a single Dart file, which scans the app or drawing. So essentially you're working from bottom to top. It's like building blocks. It's like building Lego. You don't start off with the big Lego build, right? You start off with the small bricks, right? And if you've ever seen the Lego instructions, you might see that, first of all, if you're building a robot, for example, maybe it's a little Technic robot or something, you initially start off with the components, the small parts. You might start by building, let's say, something like the arm, right? You might start off by building the arm. You won't necessarily go straight for building the whole thing, right? You start off by building the arm, and you go on building the other arm. You build the torso, and then you put the two together, right? We put the three together, right? That's essentially what you're doing here as well. You're taking the Lego bricks, which is the classes, the packages, all of the tools that you will need in order to bring your app to life, essentially. The arm could be something like all of these tasks. So this could be like the arm, this could be another arm, this could be the torso. Bring it all together, you get something, right? And then eventually, once you've gotten all of these, you can bring them together in order to get your final application. Now, it may not be as easy as it sounds, and you are required to debug now and then almost everywhere, but that's essentially the basics of how you might go about thinking about creating your very own app. Essentially, you start off with the general design, just figuring out, well, what's your app going to do, right? Without going into any of the technical details as to which packages am I going to use or which classes am I going to use. You start off with just figuring out, well, what's my app going to do? It's going to do this and this and this, right? Don't worry about the programming part. You will get to that. Once you've figured out all the tasks that you are required to do, that's when you start to think about, well, what tools do I have that will allow me to perform this task? What are the packages? What are the classes? What is it already inbuilt? Or is it something that I'm going to have to get? And these are all things that you initially look at, but you don't implement anything yet. You don't actually start implementing. Essentially, you're giving yourself options. You're giving yourself options for implementation, right? In a sense, you are creating a design which has a bunch of fail-safes. Like if I find 2 or more packages that'll allow me to draw a shape onto the page or canvas, if one package doesn't work, I've got another one there for me. Right? I don't have to go back and look for it again. Sometimes none of those packages work, and you're going to have to go back to the top-down design process and maybe reevaluate it. Right? That's That's essentially how designing an app goes. So note that you don't have to create your full design first and then go to implementation. You will always, you will always, or most of the time, start off with a top-down design, go to the bottom-up implementation, and then you might see something that doesn't exactly fit. Maybe it's a design of your app, or maybe a part of the app. And so you go back and you reevaluate it, maybe change to something else, and then you do the top-down design for that task or section, and then you try and implement it again. And sometimes you go back and forth. That happens in every programmer's life. That's what happens when you are designing an app. Well, it doesn't have to be an app specifically. It can be software. It could be any kind of solution, really. Right? You got to start with some form of design based on the research that you've conducted, or things that you've seen, or based on general knowledge, based on what you already know. And then you start to implement it. And along the way, you can make changes. You can figure out what's going right, what's going wrong, and then reevaluate it as you go along. Okay, but hopefully this video does help, and these 2 pages I 110% recommend you to go on. In fact, you probably should go on to these pages and take a look at some of the documentation. You don't have to read everything. Like, the cookbook has a lot of really cool things with regards to, let's say, networking, plugins, and some other cool features that you can implement into your application. This is actually a lot of things that you can implement into your app. Maybe you might be searching for something very, 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 very specific. And for that, you might want to go into the pub.dev page and see if someone's already compiled something that you might be able to use for your app. But other than that, I think that's about it. Hope you guys had a great time, and hopefully I get to see you guys soon. Thank you for watching.